both Kurt and I were running a bit behind today. We settled on the lineup order approximately 1 minute ago. So we're all set to go. We're extremely organized as usual. Kurt's put the order in the chat. I'll just say it. We've got Laddie Classic to start, Port Charlotte 10. We thought it'd be fun to just talk about the two principal Bruichladdich styles. I mean, there's really a third that's pretty common, but you rarely see it from OBs. Yeah, there's the fourth, but like that fourth one, they don't really. And I mean, Kurt, if we want to get really pedantic, we can go down the X5 route, or whatever the hell that was. So anyway, then we're going to do the Finglassie because it's kind of the odd one out in this whole rigmarole. Then we're going to do the 04 Bruichladdich, 02 Bruichladdich, the 02 Port Charlotte, and then the 05 Port Charlotte. That's the order. And joining Kurt and I this evening is our friend Doug, who informed us only moments ago that he is playing a drinking game tonight. Every time Kurt mentions the word sulfur, he has to do a shot. I predict Doug will not last more than an hour, but that's just not because of drugs or Doug's ability to consume, but you know, the other side of the equation there. But anyway, Doug, thanks for joining us. Kurt, as always.
Yes, mate.
Yeah. I just remembered I got to do one last thing. Kurt, do you want to maybe talk up for our Calgary folk? We've got what, a few tastings where there's still spots left. 2 brewers and Saturday, and then our festival. We've got a festival next Thursday, a week Thursday, that we're going to put some cool stuff into.
We should probably start working on that and talking about what we're actually going to do for that, hey?
We probably should.
Yeah, we're last minute, not just for these tastings, but literally planning these events as well. 2 brewers on Saturday. That was a crazy price for that one. Anybody that's local to us, I think it's $25 to hear. Is it both of the Bobs or just one of the Bobs?
Just one of the Bobs. Are they both named Bob?
Yeah, I think so. Bob Baxter and Bob something, I think.
Bob Baxter is the only one who ever leaves the distillery brewery, so that's the only one I know.
Good guys.
Yeah, they're good guys. But yeah, it's a good lineup, and you know, there's new discount, you know, airlines that disappoint customers in Canada, so you could get like a Flair Airlines ticket here pretty cheap, probably come for the tasting and fly home. It would be incredibly irresponsible for the environment and other such considerations, but I'm just saying you could do it for a fairly inexpensive tasting. Anyway, we always kind of showcase a few things coming up. It might be a little late to get a tasting kit for this if you're out of town, but Angus McRailed will be joining us on Thursday night. It's an early one because Angus has a wee baby and needs to not do this super late. This might be the last time we can actually get him to do something like this at this hour because, yeah, as I said, he's got a small child and he's getting married. I think he's getting married right about now.
I think it was last weekend he got married.
Last weekend. There you go. So I knew it was in June. We'll be able to raise a toast to him on Thursday in person. You can't get tickets for that. It's sold out. Sorry to rub it in your face. But yeah, Bob Baxter, you can't get tickets for Lefroy. It gets sold out too. But you can get tickets for the Spring Single Malt Festival Spectacular. We threw the word spectacular in there just because why not? And then there's other tastings coming up too. Renegade Rums with Jane Nurse. This is a really cool rum distillery. This is only in person. It's not a virtual event. And Mark Reynier, the guy who, well, really, we're going to be tasting a bunch of the whiskeys he was responsible for tonight at Bruichladdich. Left that, started Waterford to shake up not just the Irish whiskey industry, but the whiskey industry in general. And then he went to Granada and opened a rum distillery that nearly broke him to do the same there. But some really cool things, really exciting to see what comes along with that. I'm unfortunately going to miss this one. I'm going to be away, but I'm sure there's more than a few rum folk who will be keen on it. We've got a sake tasting. We've got other stuff I want to quickly scan through to here. Here we go. Signatory, July 11th. If you're not busy, the first Tuesday of Stampede. We have a signatory lineup that includes 4 new cask strength bottlings, 2 sherry bombs in the 46 range. Well, technically 3. But one of these guys, this guy here is an unnamed Isla, also known as Lefroy, a 1990 vintage Lefroy. It's 90 or 91, one or the other. Doesn't matter. It's going to be a cool tasting. Compass Box coming up, more than half sold out. Daft Mill, we might have to open another bottle for this because this tasting's gone really, really fast. This is one of the coolest distilleries you may or may not have ever heard of before. It took 3.5 years, but I finally have 6 different Daft Mills, so we can do a vertical of it. So we're going to do a vertical of Daft Mill. So that's coming up. And then Nothing But North Star Whiskies. Ian Croucher has still not replied to my email, but there was Campbellton Malts Festival. I don't know if he went to Feshiel as well. Maybe he'll join us at the ungodly hour of 2 a.m. British Standard Time for this tasting. But even if he doesn't, you'll have fun with your friends at Kensington Wine Market. So those are some things coming down the pipeline in the months ahead. And we may have some other exciting tastings to tell you about in August and September shortly. But for now, let's get to some Rest and Be. There's no, there's no smoking gun that says what I've been saying, and maybe Kurt's been saying, and I've also been writing, that the Rest and Be Bruichladdich casks are Mark Reynier's personal casks, but it's hard to see how they aren't when you consider that Rest and Be is owned by Fox Fitzgerald, who are the exporters for Waterford whiskies. They've also got a hand, I believe, in the Renegade rum world. So the two companies are very tightly intertwined, shall we say. And, people who owned and brought distilleries back to life, much as they did with Bruichladdich in 2000, would have put a lot of their own casks down over time. And eventually you got to sell them off, right? Eventually you got to liquidate them. I know Jim McEwen did a whole bunch of his casks with a company that the name escapes me, but I had a chat with them a couple of weeks back. They're looking to come to Canada too. Mark
Reynier, cask whisperer stuff.
What's that?
Is that the cask whisperer stuff?
No, it's something else. It's something else. It'll come to me at a random moment during the tasting, and I'll blurt it out, interrupting someone. But that's where we'll leave it for this point in time. The point is that a lot of independent bottlers have had Bruichladdich from time to time. Most of those casks are casks that would have been acquired from private owners. But the speculation is that a lot of these guys here are casks that Mark set down himself. So whether that's true or not, it doesn't really matter. It kind of is fun to just say and speculate that. But what we're going to do to start out here, we're going to start out with one of what I feel is the most underrated single malts around, incredibly good value. And that's the Bruichladdich Laddie Classic. The Laddie Classic, I'll be honest, I remember when Bruichladdich came back to life in the mid to late 2000s. They had their core range of 10, 15, I think 17 was in there, and then there'd be the odd older expressions. And they were really, really cool whiskeys. And I think when they dropped the 10 and they went to some whiskeys like this Laddie Classic, I was like a lot of other people. I was not impressed by the no age statements. I felt they were just trying to shove younger whiskey on us at the same price they used to charge for their age statement bottlings. And while there may have been some truth to that in the early years, we've opened the Laddie Classic about 3 times in the last 2 years, and I've been blown away by how good it is. And have been, I remember, Kurt, we did a tasting. Didn't we do a Bruichladdich tasting earlier this year? And it was hands down my favorite whiskey of the entire range, including the Octomores and the Black Arts.
It's crazy because I think there's a lot of people that aren't aware that little 5-digit code on the back of those bottles opens up all of the information for these things. And I think we do have to give a little bit of credit here. They might still be NAS, but when you look at what the cask makeup is, there's a lot of casks in there that go into upper years. There's a real eye to producing a consistent flavor profile, even though the casks are completely inconsistent. There's wine casks sometimes, there's sherry casks. It changes all the time, but you can still see the Laddie DNA. I think that takes something. It's pretty cool.
Well, and I guess you could also throw out there, if they're changing it, but it's staying a good bottling doesn't matter. And
No,
I mean,
it's the Springbank ethos, right?
exactly. I mean, that was the analogy I was going to draw there. Like, especially the 10-year, which I think the 15 gets a bit overrated because of the sherry. The 10-year, which is more bourbon cask and a bit more spirit driven. I think the real geeks, that's the one they hunt for. And spoiler alert, I think the current batch of 15 that we just got of Springbank is Salford, but we'll just leave it at that.
Does that count, Doug?
What's
No,
that?
you
Does
say
that count if Andrew says it?
yeah, only when you do it. I'm trying to defend my liver at this point of the evening. So.
It's too early. It's too early to go down that rabbit hole. I agree. It's not exactly the same every time, but if it's still good and it's offering good value, which, at $89, it's a little more expensive than it was a couple years ago, but you could make an argument that it's still really good value, especially when you dig deeper and realize this is not just a vehicle to sell or to push young whiskeys on people. They are going into some of their more mature stocks to round it out.
Yeah, it's cool. And I think too, you got to acknowledge the 50% is that's pretty generous, man. Like 46 is kind of the place where I'm giving, a little golf clap and stuff, but 50, if you're already non-chill filtering and a ton of your audience loves big cask strength whiskeys, that's enticement for me. I think it's really cool they did that. And you know me, I like the old school kind of challenging whiskeys. And this to me is one of those kind of funky old school whiskeys, like kind of lactic, kind of weird. I think a lot of people love it for packaging, and I think they take it home and maybe feel a little bit disappointed. But those that know whiskey love this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this really shines through that beautiful, creamy, sort of lactic minerality that I've come to love so much with Bruichladdich, it feels like. And this is a great expression of it, I think, and very reasonably priced, and hopefully will stay on the shelf for a bit.
I love that sweetness and saltiness together on it. It's really cool.
For me on the nose, it's got that little bit of barley that you expect in a younger malt, but some nice cheesy tones, honey, waxy fruits. And I actually think there's a little bit of peat in this too. And I'm getting it on the palate too. There's just some little faint hint of clean smoke in there for me.
I think you're right. My senses feel a little bit off today, but I think I'm with you on that. I think there's a wee touch of smoke in there.
Well, at first I was like, I'm getting it on my nose. Is it maybe it's just a note? It's some kind of an off note in there, but I'm definitely getting it on the palate. It's trace, like it's less than Ben Romick. Like we're down at maybe there's 1 or 2 parts per million in here. It's just a faint hint of smoke, but it's there. The palate on this, I mean, imagine this whiskey in another 10 years, it's going to be like a tropical fruit bomb, like a waxy tropical fruit bomb. So I think it's great. I think that's a sign of some really cool things to come from Bruichladdich in the years ahead. And that's a great starting point.
At the risk of already stirring up FOMO here, we did spill the beans on this one already, so it's not a secret at this point. When we were in Victoria for the Whiskey Festival, Andrew and I did a Laddie tasting together. One of them was blind, and as we went through it, we kind of came to that nosing along and kind of both looked at each other and went, "Holy crap, what is this?" It just knows like this beautiful old style whiskey. And it's,
we were ahead of the presenter, and we were way ahead. And then we had to wait.
It was a tease, but it's an 18-year-old core Bruichladdich coming, like core range. They're going from no age statement to 18. I think that's ballsy. I think that's cool. And that whiskey, at least batch 1, it's always best foot forward. Batch 1 is absolutely killer. Can't wait for it.
No. All right. Shall we on to Port Charlotte? This is
a Charlotte guy?
Sorry, Kurt?
Are you a Port Charlotte guy?
I do like Port Charlotte. I think it's kind of lost, like when Port Charlotte came out with like the PC 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. the first couple especially, I think really blew me away, and I got really into it then. It's a whiskey that I think has probably faded into the background for me for the last 10 years or so. But I'm kind of coming around to it again. And I don't know if that's just that, like, I got over the, massive young peaty high ABV whiskeys. I got into the sherry stuff, then I got into the really light, delicate stuff. I think I've got a more rounded appreciation of everything now, but there was definitely a period where I kind of lost interest in Port Charlotte. What about you?
I think it's the best thing Bruichladdich makes. I wish they did it full time. I like the other lines too, but Port Charlotte's always had my heart. Do you remember grilling Fraser when we were in Victoria about the PC series? And he let slip that when they were about to flow for the first time, they realized they forgot to order malt. So they had to petition the Port Ellen Maltons. So that PC 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 to 12, I believe, series was actually Isla peat. I think that's why they're so drastically different. Everything after that was peat from the mainland, a different malt source. So those early PCs, absolute rock stars. This is a different spirit, Andrew's right. It's easy to see why he'd kind of maybe step away from it because it evolved. But I just love this. This is a wicked challenging whiskey, I think, for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Doug, thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting one, right? I feel like, there was, things kind of shifted over to Octomore a little bit more during sort of that, especially in that for me, at least, sweet spot of sort of the 6th and 7th sort of releases. And then now it feels like sort of that pendulum is swinging back a little bit, where folks are, rediscovering some of the Port Charlotte and, quite frankly, the Laddie as well. And, especially to be able to get some of the naked spirits that aren't necessarily, lots of wine casks or, something that has a massive influence and still has some of that sort of naked spirit to it. I'm always a big fan of, I think, generally.
Yeah.
And it's cool seeing them getting older finally too, like the ones we're going to hit here. Like Doug, when we were over in 2009 in the Port Charlotte warehouses, do you remember that Oloroso sherry cask, Port Charlotte? It was one of the best whiskeys I've ever had. Like really, really awesome Port Charlotte with a ton of age on it. I think it was 17 years old or something.
Yeah.
Just like nothing else you get your hands on. It's so cool. Really, really cool to watch Port Charlotte finally getting older. Like I can't even conceive of what a 25, 21 even Port Charlotte is going to be like. It's going to be incredible.
Well, and it's such an interesting time, right? When Mark came in and bought the distillery, money was tight, right? And so we really see, I think, when they got good casks and they got good wood, I think we see some beautiful, beautiful spirit. And I think some of the inconsistency comes from a wood policy that wasn't always consistent back in the day, and an owner that was a wine merchant, right? And so tried to bring a lot of those ideals of wine, including the casks, into whiskey. And I think certainly there's some successes that you can point to, and I think there's other ones that are probably less so. But just really quickly too on the warehouse tasting, Curtin, you and I mentioned a little bit that there's sort of 4 different spirits that were traditionally made sort of there. The 4th being Lockendall, which you see a little bit from a couple of independent bottlers, generally people who had bought private casks, but I don't think they've made it in quite some time. And so that's even interesting to me. Like, what are they doing with that stock that they do own? Are they blending it into, a little bit into sort of the classic Laddie, and that's where we're pulling in a little bit of that peat from? Or
I don't think they ever made very much Lockendall. That's the issue.
It was only about 4 or 5 years, I think, that they were actually producing it.
But when you go in there, there's a fair few casks stenciled as Lockendall, but talking with Alan, they're all privately owned. So for those that aren't fully in the loop, it sits between Port Charlotte and Octomore. It's at 50 ppm,
which is so ridiculous. Because like the one thing I have to say about Bruichladdich that has been a bit frustrating, even though I there's a definite difference. You've got Bruichladdich, which is unpeated, and then you talk about Port Charlotte, which is heavily peated. And then what is Octomore? Is like super heavily peated? Because compared to like Ardbeg, Laphroaig, Kalila, Lagavulin, and like Port Charlotte's up there in terms of ppm. Like it's so, I mean, why bother making something between Port Charlotte and Octomore? Like,
Nonsense.
Well, just to be a little bit of a contrarian with the two of you, they take different cuts for Lockendall, was my understanding, right?
Oh, cool.
So
that's why it's cheesier, right?
yeah, for sure. So that they were trying to get some deeper stuff out of it, even though it was only 5 or 10 ppm more than Port Charlotte. They were trying to take much deeper cuts, and that's where you got some pretty crazy inconsistency with it. So it wasn't just the malt that I think they were trying to experiment with.
Well, now I wonder if it was also an issue of like maybe the fermentation time was longer for it too. And the reason I throw that out there is the boutique guys, the label they created for Lockendall was like basically a nursery of babies, but instead of babies being in bassinets, it was all wheels of cheese. And so I think that Lockendall might have a reputation for being even cheesier and more lactic than some other Bruichladdich. So maybe that was part of it too, is that it was a longer fermentation. So.
Yeah. Well, if anybody wants to try it, I think Kevin on the Zoom tonight has some samples left, so we can all meet at his house afterwards.
Kevin, I'm coming.
Kevin Deleckner.
Oh, is that Kevin?
Kevin Deleckner, yes.
Yes. Okay, it's a ruse. I see. I see.
He's all keeping us on our toes.
And I saw there were some notes in the chat too, and we don't want to linger here too long on this, but I think part of what brought me back to Port Charlotte is like what Jeff and some others have said. The prices on the Octomores have gotten kind of ludicrous. 5-year-old whiskeys, and when you can get the Port Charlotte 10-year for like effectively a third of the price of a bottle of Octomore. And I mean, this is a gorgeous whiskey. It's got some age behind it. It's still bottled at a high ABV too, like 50%. That's a damn good whiskey. And you can see some interesting parallels between it and the Laddie Classic that we had before. They both have this velvety, vanilla, cheesy tones, malt, soft fruits. But then you're adding in this peat, but the peat after 10 years is mellowed a reasonable amount too.
I think too, with Port Charlotte, I get more of a caramelly kind of note. And I think it's that buttery character marrying with that peat, and oftentimes sherry casks or something that they're using too. It just seems a little sweeter and caramelly. Yeah, really cool.
Yeah, very cool indeed. All right, we're going to move on to try one of these things that's not like the others in tonight's lineup. And that's the Rest and Be Finglassie. If you're not familiar with Finglassie, you're probably not alone. Finglassie is the name that's used for whiskey from the Inchdarnie Distillery that's been sold off to either brokers or independent bottlers. So there is no distillery called Finglassie. This is not a single cask, it's a batch bottling, 5 years in ex-Isla bourbon casks. And what else have we got here? I think there's some sherry as well too, finished in Oloroso sherry butts. We've had a prior bottling of Finglassie. Kurt, was it from Cooper's Choice? Is that where we saw that before?
Yes, it was. That was a dirty, dirty, dirty whiskey.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I don't expect this to be too different. Like, I've just barely nosed it and that's it. I should put this back up here. I will say, I kind of like the bottle. Like, it's kind of a fun label. Very colorful. I don't know what the story behind all the animals are. Maybe they're things you drive by on your way to Rest and Be on the west coast of Scotland, but I suppose we could look into that. Yeah, this is a young single malt, going in, well, blind like the rest of you on this. I have not tried this before, so oh man.
It's so crazy. It's so crazy. Like, this is Willy Wonka. This is Johnny Depp in Alice in Wonderland to me. It's so out there. It's all botanical and gin notes on the nose, but all mezcal on the palate. Like, crazy weird. A little bit of bug spray.
Well, and the interesting thing is this was a fairly large batch. Like it's not even like it's a single cask rather. So you can imagine that if this is sort of the sum of the parts, how crazy were some of those individual casks that were probably in there from sort of that dirty vegetal note sort of perspective that I certainly am a big fan of at times. So
there's almost a little bit of Jamaican rum in there too on the palate.
So a quick search of Whiskey Base, which knows all, shows that there have only been 4 bottlings of Finglassie. At least there's only 4 on their website. This is a batch of almost 5,000 bottles. So you're right, Doug, like quite a few casks in there. This is like on the nose to me, like it has this note that I've only ever gotten in one of the Loch Lomond styles. And it's like when you have when your like laptop catches on fire and the plastic wires start burning, and then maybe the little bit of the plastic starts burning too. Like it is such a chemically medicinal smoky tone on the nose.
Well,
That,
oh, sorry, Kurt.
I was just gonna say, do you remember those nosing kits that had the little essential oil things in them?
Yeah.
If you opened the one that said phenol or phenolic or whatever, that's what it smelled like. A lot like this, that burnt motherboard, burnt electronic kind of smell.
Well, Inchdarnie is such an interesting distillery, right? Where they're kind of very unique, where you see so many of these distilleries putting out, 3, 4, 5-year-old whiskey. Their model, Ian Palmer, who is sort of the founder of it and is the master distiller, sort of built it up and sold a big portion of the spirit towards blends. They've sold off a little bit. They've got a couple of different versions. They do a seasonal one, which they've done rye and wheat and some other stuff. They've got a peated that they do pretty regularly and a non-peated. And then really they've committed that they're not going to be releasing any of their own stuff till at least 10 years old, maybe 12 years old, similar to sort of Daft Mill in that regard. So it'll be very interesting in another, 6 years, 5, 6 years when we start seeing some of their stuff hitting, but it's also a fair sized distillery. So I suspect they're actually going to have a reasonable amount of stock laid down, even over and above what they've sold off to blenders and some of the independent bottlers.
Yeah. So do you think that's what's happening with the Cooper's Choice and this Rest and Bee bottling, is that this is stock sold to blenders under the term Finglassie? So it's not like Rest and Bee bought 5,000 bottles worth of Finglassie from the distillery. Or do you think that there are independent bottlers that they're willing to work with on that front?
Yeah, no, there definitely are independent bottlers. With it, they had a cask program as well for individual and investors for a little bit. And, again, interestingly, every year they do a slightly different theme, or every quarter it's a different cask that you get and a different grain. So, they're trying to bring back or start British rye again and some of the wheat and some of these experimental ones. And they're doing some interesting stuff where they're just buying huge parcels of different casks, anything from, wine, sherry, port, different bourbon with it, depending on whatever sort of quarter. So it'll be interesting to see how they blend those all together and whether that there'll be individual releases or whether they start bringing and melding some of those.
Yeah, kind of like what Holyrood's done, where every year for their private cask program, they create like 1 or 2 different styles that you can buy into. And that's the style that they're doing that year. Yeah. Can we just quickly comment before moving on how I appreciate how Devin with a K has color coordinated his clock and his shirt tonight. I mean, that's absolutely top notch.
It's very impressive. He usually only brings out the colored shirts for his court dates and whatnot. So hopefully he had an okay day, all things considered. So
funny. I'm sure he'd love to say something, but he can't unmute himself. So.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah. Let's go on to the Bruichladdich Rest and Bee 2004. I'm, I have to full disclosure, I'm going into this with extremely high expectations for this one, because this one blew me away when we first got it. I think this is the one where we maybe don't have a ton left, because it, at least at first for me, outshone the older one to come, the 2002. And I think the reason for that's probably somewhat self-explanatory. If I remember correctly, this one is probably just straight ex-bourbon. Where is it there?
Wow.
Yeah, it just says barrel, type barrel.
Beautiful nose. This I feel like this is a whiskey the dude from The Big Lebowski would enjoy. It reminds me of a White Russian in many regards.
Wow, cool note.
Yeah, it has that milky Kahlua
Yeah.
coffee kind of tone there. For me, I was gonna go Maltesers, and like, have you ever had when they take jujubes and they dip them in milk chocolate? Kind of reminds me of that too.
Or jujubes and yogurt, like white yogurt. It's still got that sour. Jeff says the same, cheesy and mildly creamy baby vomit. 100%. It's got that kind of sourness now with a lot of fruits coming up through age. This is one of those things where that's not a pretty whiskey in most senses. Like when you think of all the fruit bomb mainstream space ciders and stuff that people are drinking because they don't really understand whiskey, they're going to struggle with a whiskey like this, but this is stunning.
Oh man, the palate is gorgeous though. Like there's like a big vein of malt, lots of fruit, mostly orchard fruit, more milk chocolate. It's still got that lactic cheesy tone, but the fruit and everything else is balancing it out. Like it's just, this is juicy to me.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Like the baby vom note is really fascinating, where you can see that through a lot of Bruichladdich. But I mean, it's bucolic acid, which is basically our stomach acid. When you meld it with an alcohol sort of compound, turns into sort of a really nice vanilla note, and it feels like all the bucolic acid hasn't quite converted over and attached to it, and so you kind of get that sort of cheesy, vanilla-y, creamy sort of note that's yeah, I think quite lovely on
it.
Kevin
Kevin says 98 pointer after that Finglassie. That was a challenging one, but it wasn't bad. I actually kind of dig it.
I actually give props to that bottling of Finglassie for, putting lipstick on a pig effectively. Like this is a rough and raw 5-year-old malt that has got at least some people thinking it's kind of interesting and sort of fun in a weird way. So, but yeah, the Bruichladdich kind of knocks it out of the park. This was like, I don't know, a pop fly that like barely made it off the ground. And the Bruichladdich is a home run by comparison.
So the nose on that Bruichladdich is pretty. It reminds me of some of those older Bruichladdich that they used to release as like 16, 17s, 18s, whatever. The palate though has so much more going on. I love that dram.
Yeah, the old 22 I just used to love when it was around, and it was just sort of that beautiful, clean sort of note. But there's a creaminess and a depth here that you get that's just so much more, it feels like. So
yeah, Jeff, tell us how you really feel about Octomore. Is all I got to say to that. So yeah, I think this is great. I mean, this does have, if you look at that 16 and 22, the blue tin ones that came out about, I want to say 8 to 10 years ago, which were like really toasty, very active ex-bourbon casks. This is sort of going in that direction. But just, yeah, wonderful spirit and yeah, a great dram, but we should probably move on to the next one. I have a feeling this next one might be a little bit more polarizing. So the next one is the 2002 Rest Bruichladdich. And now we are moving into wine cask territory. And I just got to quickly pull it up from on here. What have we got? Hogshead X wine cask at cask strength. So
keeping in mind that this was that period of like absolutely goopy wet fill casks at Bruichladdich. Nothing would have been rinsed, toasted, anything. So this is just wet fill wine barrels at this point.
Well, you might remember there was some controversy at the time, mainly amongst angry old white men, because some of the whiskeys were coming out pink, and they were saying like they were accusing Bruichladdich of bottling whiskey for gays, which, I mean, think about that now. Imagine if somebody blurted that out today. Yeah, I remember that was funny. You know, back to a comment Doug had made earlier, I think you guys were talking about earlier with the 2004 rather. I think what's cool about some of the Bruichladdich casks that maybe we'll see over time is that a lot of them were put into whatever casks they could put their hands on at the time, which were a lot of refill casks and ex-bourbon. And I think those whiskeys are really going to show well over time. The wet fill wine casks, I mean, I think there's people who like them. There's definitely a place for them.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm a little less anti-wine cask than Kurt, but not a lot. So,
well, and I am a proponent of what's happening with wine casks. We've said it lots of times in these tastings. I think wine casks are going to be really good in the future because everything is being rinsed, everything is being STR'd and stuff. The last, I don't know, year or two of wine casks have been so much better than what we were getting for so long there. It's one of those things that's kind of making me let my guard down a little bit, and I should probably be a little more cautious than that.
yeah, the STR and the rinsed wine casks, I mean, I think those are people handling them better than they did previously. But yeah, Bruichladdich, and not just Bruichladdich, but even Murray McDavid, their independent bottling arm that they had and sold off as well, had a lot of like really goopy, not great, like Amarone finished Ardbeg. Like they would take Ardbeg and somehow find a way to ruin it by putting it into a wet Amarone cask. And sometimes for as little as 2 weeks there, and they called it acing. It wasn't even finishing, it was acing. In some cases it was a week or two. It was literally just blending in whatever liquid was in that cask before they dumped the whiskey in it.
But think about when that was too, right? Like that was really, so the distillery was reacquired in 2000, started flowing in 2001 for the first time, right? Those whiskeys, they said they had to re-rack a ton of stuff that they inherited from the White and Mackay portfolio and everything. Those would have gone into those casks at a time when there wasn't a lot of that in the industry. Like Glenmorangie had started doing it and stuff, but there wasn't a ton of finishing and stuff. So they were kind of pioneering a lot of these things and didn't know how a lot of it was going to turn out probably at this point, right?
Just imagine though if they'd left some of that tired old second and third fill casks from White and Mackay to just keep maturing. Like it was a little tear.
It's heartbreaking to think of, right? You tried the legacy bottles, right?
Yeah.
Oh man, like next level stuff. And it's kind of the Port Charlotte or the Port Ellen theory too, right? Well, we know Port Ellen sat in really, really dead wood for 25, 30 years. That's why they're so bloody stunning. Bruichladdich had the same thing. They just let all these old casks sleep longer in dead wood. I don't think they needed to re-rack anything.
Yeah, it's fascinating even thinking back to the closure of Bruichladdich, because you know they had White Mackay owned Jura and Laddie at the same time, and they ended up shutting down Bruichladdich over Jura only because Jura had received I think some newer renovations and was a little bit more modern, but
and it had water jackets.
But it's fascinating to look at some of the weird cheesy notes that we get out of both of those distilleries. And I think even Jura today can be very much all over the map and is a title contender for any weird whiskey challenge, I feel like.
Oh man, I think Jura suffers from the fact that when they rebuilt it, they put the largest bloody stills into it. And I think it suffers in large part from copper contact. I mean, there's a lot of other problems it has too, but I think one of them is the stills and the copper contact. It just doesn't get enough exposure. So,
I don't know how it ends up being such a nutty spirit, but I really struggle with Jura. It's one of my least favorite distillates. There are some great ones, but
we say that, I mean, we're spoiled, Kurt. Like I know you remember the 76 and the 77 vintages. Back when Willie Tate, who looked like Captain Highliner, would come over and do tastings and talk about how nobody likes eating box, which is a whole story in itself. We haven't talked about this whiskey. What do you guys think of this? I'm actually enjoying it more than I did when I tried it for the first time.
Yeah, I can see how for folks who don't enjoy sulfur or again another very sort of dirty whiskey, they might not enjoy this, but I actually think this is quite lovely. I could not drink it all night long, but
No.
I think there's a richness there that's really interesting. And again, my palate tends to skew more towards the Wojtek side as opposed to the Kurt side of things. So your my opinion is worth exactly as much as you're paying for it this evening, but I still enjoy it. Kurt, what about you?
These are the whiskeys that really, really, really hurt me, because everything beyond the sulfur, if you can like look beyond it, it's almost tropical, it's tangy, it's jujube. There's lots of figgy notes, lots of jammy notes.
It's Turkish delight. The whole
There's
whiskey.
so much
knows
cool
it's
stuff in there.
Turkish delight.
And then it's
like
then
Turkish delight, but with a tinge of Erdogan in it. So,
Jeez.
that's
no.
Doug,
I
is that
still want to drink it.
my list?
There's so many cool notes. I still want to drink it, but it just
No.
it leaves such a burnt note on the palate. That's what I really struggle with.
I'm not sure I have enough whiskey in my house right now for the number of shots that are likely coming up for me over these next couple of ones with Kurt. So I see that the comments are already blowing up.
I'm with Doug on this one. I know there's a twinge of something there, but to me, it's like it's adding to the broader picture of the whiskey. Like you said, Kurt, underneath it, it's starting to go really, really ripe, exotic fruit. It's chocolate, Turkish delight, big Turk for me. Like, this is like a nostalgic dram. It reminds me for some reason of like candy bars from like my teenage years. And I think I can forgive the flaws in this because I don't think it's big enough. At least it's not big enough for it to ruin the experience for me at all.
And I would go further. I would say it makes me feel a little bit nostalgic. Doug hinted at some good, some bad in the past. Andrew, you as a retailer, because I was not retail at this point, but you must have hated those days when here's 10 different bottlings of Lings, here's 10 different 16s in white tins, here's 10 micro provenance, here's peat, rocks, waves. Like there was so much bloody Bruichladdich on the walls, and it was going to be a gamble. It was a minefield. Some were great, some were not, but it was always interesting. And now the range is so narrow, and it's like Bruichladdich used to be that, like, remember the pull tab lottery things? It was always fun with Bruichladdich like that.
Yeah. It was extremely frustrating, especially since it was not my money at the time. And my boss was like, why do we have so much of this stuff? And I was like, because people want it, and they want it even if it's not good. And like she came around to it. But I mean, this is at a point where we maybe had 120 whiskeys, single malt whiskeys in our shop. And that was like toe to toe, the biggest selection at the time. I know that sounds crazy today, but like 120 bottles, like people would come in and be like, wow, you have more than 50 different single malts. That's insane. And like a quarter of them were Bruichladdich at one point. So it was frustrating, but Kurt, like you said, there were some in there, like 1 out of every 3 to 5 was like knockout. And
remember Golder Still?
Mm-hmm.
The ex-bourbon, like 1984 or something, I think.
I regret not buying one of those. As much as people were like all over the blacker still and the redder still, the Golder Still was the best of the 3, like for sure. So there were some lovely expressions that came out over time. But like you said, they can't all be great. The one I would love to try again, because I remember when I tried it, did you ever try the 125th anniversary one, the one that came out it was like in a terrible box, and I want to say it was like an early 80s vintage, and it was so low ABV and it was so light, and compared to everything else Bruichladdich, it was just like, oh, this is boring, there's nothing there. But
I don't know the one you're referring to. I need to know now.
Well, the reason I bring it up is because like 18-ish years later, I would love to try that whiskey again because I have a feeling it's probably more in my wheelhouse than it was back then. Yeah, I'm trying to figure. I'll dig it up. Like there was a 125th anniversary Bruichladdich released. I'm just trying to see if I can find. Here we go. It was in 1972. Crazy. Yeah, here I'll share my screen so people can see it.
I have never seen that bottle in my life.
Here we go. This is the one I'm talking about. Anyway, at the time, I just thought it was kind of bland and boring and not interesting. I would love to try that again to see if, I mean, it's got really high scores on Whiskey Base to see if I'd actually have a better appreciation for it now. Like having been at the, deep end of the peat pool, the deep end of the sherry pool, and now just looking for beautiful and complex and elegant, I'd love to try that whiskey again if I had the chance. Jeff's wondering, Doug, if you've had any shots yet.
I mean, I'm a little scared at this point because I made the joke and then I realized that some of you are going to hold me accountable, and I see number of folks who are yelling out shot in the comments at multiple times, and so now I'm just scared and I'm shutting down.
You know what? Should maybe Devin with a K, should he maybe be a surrogate for you and have a couple of shots?
I would be wholly supportive of that, although Kevin and I were drinking till about 1 o'clock last night in the morning as well, on different stuff. So I think we're both recovering a little bit today as well.
But based on both his shirt and his clock, I would say he's partying right now, so he's probably good to go.
That is the fun. Kevin is definitely out today, I feel like.
Doug, I've been kind to you. I have tap danced around the word. I have been as careful as I can be to not say that word.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, on that note, shall we move on to the 2002? All right.
Oh. Wow. I see a couple of notes about rum in the comments. And for me, I immediately get taken to a Jamaican sort of Hampton style of funk and rum that is super, super fascinating.
People I think malign Christmas cake unfairly. There's good Christmas cake out there. My mom happens to make a very good Christmas cake. I'm pretty sure she soaks it in rum. But there's also like white Christmas cake. And this kind of reminds me of like that lighter, whiter style of Christmas cake. And it is quite rum-like on the nose. I would concur.
Rum on the palate too.
Well, what's incredible though is like the wine casks or wine cask used in this is so prominent that I think a lot of people would miss the fact that this is a peated whiskey until they took a sip. I guess it's 20 almost, or is it 20 years of age? I think it's 20 years of age.
Well, certainly the phenols are going to be lessening and softening quite a bit there. So it's easier for the cask just completely dominate.
It's a deeper kind of meatier style than the previous one we had with all the cask influence on the last one too. Kind of charry meats with like a nice like bark on the outside of it.
It's quite drying on the palate, like mid palate in the finish, I find as well. Sort of denoting a bit more of a tannic note that I would generally get from that, but I think it's so sweet and rich that you only really feel it on the finish a bit more.
Yeah, I think based on the nose, I was expecting a much more juicy, fruity palate, and I agree it's a lot more dry, a lot spicier. There are some decadent notes there, but to me, it's like some of the batches of Black Art, but if you were to make the Black Art peated, this is to me very reminiscent of that.
The scariest thing, though, I think for me is the mental picture that I'm getting right now of Jeff's comment about working in a grocery store, buying all of the Christmas cake the day after. and peeling off the top and eating that and tossing out the cake. So
Like just
I miss my grounds.
like just eating, Jeff, were you just eating the candied fruit off of it? Is that okay?
No, just the marzipan on the top. I think he's
Oh, okay. My mom used to make, like, my mom's Christmas cake was, she'd wrap it in like a terry cloth or something, like it was like super old school. Yeah. I do need to get her mincemeat recipe, which involves real meat and is absolutely my favorite dessert of all time is mincemeat pie. But I gotta get that recipe. The Christmas cake one though, that can live in my memory forever. I don't think I need to know how to make that, but any other comments on this one, guys? Kurt, are you a thumbs up or a thumbs down? I'm just curious. Be honest.
you want me to be honest?
Mhm.
I'm actually a big thumbs up. Really big thumbs up. There's some sulfur there. There's no two ways about it. More on the palate than on the nose, but it's not enough. It's kind of like how Springbank gets a bit of a pass. I said it, Doug.
I know.
This
Jeff
one
was on it in the comments too.
This one's pretty badass. Again, I think it's a little bit challenging, and I think it's one I want to spend a lot of time with. But you can absolutely see the Port Charlotte character showing through. You get a little bit of that Bruichladdich, but to me, it's unmistakable Port Charlotte.
Mhm. Good.
Yeah, it's super fascinating, right? Like I think it's easy to get overwhelmed. And again, I'm glad that my palate took a while to get to this because I don't know if I would enjoy it as much as I do now earlier in there, because there's that sort of Jamaican funk with a little rubbery note in there, the dryness in the palate. Like there's some things that immediately come to mind that might come across as disparaging, but I actually am enjoying just going through and I think experiencing it because it's quite unique in that regard, and certainly not bad. But I can see, folks on Whiskey Base or elsewhere giving it a massive range of scores.
Believe it or not, this one's got an 89.5,
Wow.
which to be honest is a bit surprising to me because the second you get like even a twinge of sulfur in there, that usually knocks against things. But I think the wine cask is also doesn't often do well with the hardcore whiskey based crowd. I mean, if he was unmuted, Kevin with a D would be able to, share his insight into that as well.
Well, I'm sure he'll go on there and immediately give it a 78 as he just roasts so many on Whiskey Base. So
I think stick your nose in the glass, hold it there for a minute, like do a long pull on it. Immediately you'll get past the sulfur, and then everything beyond that, there's like big ammonia or iodine kind of notes back there. There's like this really savory barbecue thing. There's a ton of fruit tones going on.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for that sulfur, like I would adore this whiskey.
Chewing tobacco, but also big league chew. Like it somehow has both. So
yeah, good note.
all right, let's go on to the 2005. The whiskey most likely to provoke Doug to do shots, I suspect. Rest and Port Charlotte 2005. So what do we have here? 272 bottles, 54.6%. Once more from a wine cask, ex-wine cask hogshead. Here we go. I'll put it up on the screen. And it's got a decent whiskey-based score on this one too. So having said that, it is like so leathery and dunnage, like earthy dunnage warehouse, mushroom.
I like that mushroom note.
Yeah, definitely the mushroom note.
Dulce de leche, a little bit of like sour funky cheese behind it.
Mm-hmm. I don't think it is, but it almost smells a bit. There's almost something that like that wet dog cardboardy, like a corkiness to it. But I think it's more of an earthy dunnage note than it is anything else.
That cardboardy corky note to me always really dampens the whiskey. Like all the high notes kind of disappear for me. This one still has all the prickles of high notes, but I know what you're talking about. To me, it's kind of like Ben Rennes has a little bit of that sometimes, but it still seems cleanish.
And that's why Ben Rennis is not beloved.
It's true.
You leave my Ben Rennis alone, both of you.
Man, thankfully for a couple of decently aged Catned bottlings, otherwise Ben Rennis has almost been a lost cause for me too.
It's hard.
Signatories had a couple of, like, especially 1996 vintage, like a couple of good bottlings too.
Well, and they did 2.5 times distillation, similar to Springbank, even though Springbank's 2.8. We won't go down that rabbit hole, but past, I think it was mid 2000s, 2007 or something like that, they just went to straight double distillation. I feel like it changed a little bit, but neither here nor there.
Speaking of vintages, just to throw it out there, because I know Andrew sent out the malt messenger earlier. Yeah.
No, that's coming tomorrow, I think.
Okay, I won't spoil anything then, but there's another vintage everybody needs to start watching. You shouldn't spill the beans too much because then it just disappears on me too. But you know how there's those legendary, like, 93 Glendronachs, or everybody talks about the 96 Nevis now, that's the hot one kind of thing. There was an old parcel of Isla that was just incredible. Andrew's malt messenger is going to have an interesting little run of something fun. And there's one particular vintage there that everybody should be watching. We'll come to that as soon as we can actually reveal what we're talking about. So next tasting, I'll tell you a little bit more.
Dude, now you've got me curious. Like,
I can say it, but it'll spoil your malt messenger. We all know you look like the big.
you might as well just say it.
Just say it.
Yeah.
2004 Glenfarclas has been incredible. Absolutely incredible. Like an absolute banger running, heavily sherry, dark 2004 Glenfarclas. Whiskey base scores are off the charts too. Price is good. They're rock stars.
Well, I'm excited for the malt messenger tomorrow.
Yeah. I just looked up a photo of it. Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's a good vintage. Kurt, I really truly wasn't sure where you were going with that. I mean, were you like, yeah, it could have been so many different things, but there's a few vintages in there. And I think the 2002, you're right, is still, or 2004 rather, is still not, not atrociously priced. I mean, it's expensive, but it could be worse. Because I think the other ones that really, for the longest time, and some years there were ones that were better than others, were the 89, 90, and 91s. For some reason, those three vintages of Glenfarclas family casks were great. However, I want to throw this out there too, for a completely different reason. I also think the 78 and 79s from Glenfarclas are gorgeous, and it's because most of them are, they call them fourth fill butts, but they just don't know. They've lost count of whether it's a second, third, or fourth fill. So they just call it fourth fill. And some of those, like 78 and 79 Glenfarclas, are some of the best Glenfarclas I've ever had. And they're not sherried. They're not like overly sherried.
I don't own a single 78 Glenfarclas.
You know what's so cool about those, Andrew, and what I love about them is that those butts are so old. They're from a time where there was still a lot more old growth forests and other stuff. And so I truly believe the complexity of wood is very different than a lot of the modern stuff that we have now, that sort of gets grown to sort of when they hit maturity, season it, get it out the door. And I just feel that was a different style. And so completely agree. Some of those ones, there's just just this amazing creamy delicate note that's still rich and powerful that is hard to find elsewhere.
Dude, that's a conversation that would be really, really deep. I've never given that too much thought, but you're probably right.
It is fun to kind of speculate on the provenance of the wood, especially with a couple of whiskey companies like Glenfarclas, like Gordon MacPhail, where there's a history of maturing things to great ages, where there's a history of long maturation. When you think about, like, sure, the second maturation was 40, 50, 60 years. How long was the first one? Because those are companies that have never been, like, at least as long as in living memory, they've not been companies that have ever rushed or like focused on bulk bottlings at a young age. So, I'm sure there's whiskeys we've had in the past where the collective age of time is getting very close to a century between first, second, and maybe third use. And yeah, Doug, your comment about oak, I remember 20 years ago when I started, when they talked about sherry casks, they talked about wood that was 200 years of age before it was cut, and then it was coopered, made into sherry casks. And in some cases, those sherry casks sat there for years or decades before whiskey was ever put into them. Now we're in an era where even European oak is barely, if 80 to 100 years of age. They cut it, cooper it, speed season it, and then away you go with the whiskey. So it is a very different, it has to make a difference. It just has to.
Well, it absolutely does. And what's so sad is so many of these companies can find these casks somewhere hidden behind, like last time I was in Campbellton, I was in the warehouse with Ian, and going through, and he pulled out this beautiful old transport cask, was the best way to describe it, from that was easily 60, 70 years old. He said, I found this in the back of the warehouse. I don't know how old it is. It's it had half of the head had a Gonzalez Baez sort of note, but you could see that it was just sort of stamped in there and has been worn over and had 3 or 4 different coats of paint. And he pulled it out and said, this is one of the most amazing whiskeys we have in here. And, one we just emptied, this one's almost gone, and we don't really have any more. And I said, well, what are you doing with the casks after you're done? He's like, I don't know. We'll probably just get rid of them. And I'm like, why wouldn't you intentionally go in and put something in there, for 30, 40, 50 years so that the next generation can enjoy it? And he's like, we generally just want fresh casks in there. And it's some of that narrow focus and generally a lot of big corporate thinking that pushes this stuff out. So it's so exciting with folks like, Glenfarclas, that have a family owned distillery for that long, that, is willing to do a fourth fill on a barrel that almost nobody else is, or at least no premium product that does a lot of single cask releases and other stuff like they do.
Well, and I think part of that comes down to, again, like you said, the family business. The way family businesses operate is a little different from the way that like shareholder businesses that have shareholders. Glenfarclas, I remember the story that George used to tell about the 1970s when oak was becoming hard to come by. And, you look at 1978 and 79, it's really not surprising that they were using third or fourth fill casks to mature the whiskey, because that's what they had available to them. And maybe new wood was just too expensive to buy at that time. And these family businesses would say, you know what? We're gonna take a pass on buying new casks for a few years because the prices are crazy. And then a few years later, you go through a cycle, things change, the industry collapses. All of a sudden in the 80s and 90s, you're able to start getting fresh wood again at a fair price. And even the Langs, like you look at Hunter Lang as a business, Douglas Lang as a business, back when they were just Douglas Lang, a lot of what they acquired was in the 80s and 90s when the rest of the industry was on its knees and happy just to get money for casks that they could use to pay their shareholders. And family companies don't need to worry about short-term gains. They can invest in buying stuff at a lower price when everybody else is panicking. So an interesting thought on that, because I think it plays a role. And the reason I brought this whole thing up goes back to George Grant, and it was in the 1960s and 70s, the late 60s and 70s, Glenfarclas shifted from filling its barrels or its casks at the industry standard 63.5, and they started filling them at still strength. And the reason they did this is because that oak was hard to come by. And his grandfather said, we're not in the business of maturing water. Why would we water it down before we put it into the cask? And the reason you can look at this is from vintages like 68. There was a family cask bottling that was over 30 years of age. I think it came out in 2009, and it was like 65%. And I remember asking, how is this even possible? And George said it's because my grandfather at the time didn't want to put water into the whiskey before filling it into the cask, because that just meant you needed more casks. So
Fascinating. Well, for those who are interested in learning a little bit more, Kevin put in a link on Whiskey Base just with some of these old fourth fill ones. And there's a guy, Dirk, HS 305, that along with a number of others that have a pretty amazing history on some of these sort of wood policies and history around them. So certainly encourage folks who are as nerdy as the three of us to go in and do a deep dive at some point.
Well, Doug, let's be honest. I mean, I think some of them, yourself and maybe Kurt and definitely to Kevin included, are nerdier than I in that regards, because I don't have the time. I only know what I know because I try it and have had the great fortune of doing that. But yeah. All right. Speed round. We got to go back through our whiskeys, give everybody a chance to pick their two favorites. So starting with the Laddie Classic again, how is that showing after? Oh man,
It's so creamy, it's so pretty.
how is this so good for an NAS whiskey? It almost makes me mad.
Mm.
Great arrival. Absolute perfect palate weight. I've talked about that a few times in the last few tastings, where I kind of look for that 46 to 52-ish. It just sits on the tongue right. Oils are nice. There's not too much prickle. That's a fantastic whiskey.
Yeah. I'm getting an ozone note out of it now, which I really love. For a young malt, it's salty, creamy, cheesy, fruity, really fresh. Yeah, that has to be one of the best under $100 single malts, full stop. Has to be
Agreed.
one of the best.
Agreed.
Cool. All right, Port Charlotte 10-year.
So good. There's more notes of like cola now, almost like you've glazed a ham with Coke or root beer or something like that, and kind of burnt the edges of it.
Oh yeah, that's
Yeah, and you're kind of brewing coffee in the background while making that ham, it feels like.
for a peated malt, that's kind of the full package in terms of you've got the peat influence there, you've got that maritime salty influence there, and then you've got the cask mix. I don't know that. Yeah, it's hard to it's hard to kind of wrap your head around these, and I think maybe it's because, Kurt, we've talked about this in other tastings. We get spoiled trying rare, one-off, single casks, never to be repeated expressions. And then you sit down and try some of the workhorse drams like this, and you're kind of blown away by them.
Sammy made a great comment just about how it was the first one that he finished, because he was comparing everything back to this as kind of that standard, which I think is a huge compliment to it.
It just, both of these first two just feel so dialed in, like they've got it, they know they've got it, there's a little bit of swagger to it, they just feel like incredibly well constructed whiskeys.
Well, and Kurt, that brings up an interesting point here, because the last four whiskeys in this tasting tonight are all single casks, and the Laddie Classic and that Port Charlotte 10 are both batch bottlings.
Yeah.
So that has a role to play in this. Maybe the reason it's so good is because they're doing it in a large volume, but also because they're doing it and they're actually doing it well. They're paying attention. It's not just simply a formula, picking the boxes to include the right proportion of casks. As you said before, they're allowing a bit of batch variance in order to maintain quality and focus on quality rather than trying to replicate and perfectly reproduce the same thing every time.
Great flagships.
Yeah.
Yep. Very impressive.
All right. Finglassie.
I'm a fan. It's so weird. It's so wacky. It's mellowed nicely in the glass now. It's a little bit softer. It's funky. It's messed up. There's no two ways about it.
It's-
But I think
I think
it works.
this is what it would smell like to be at a street carnival in Tijuana on a podcast.
High praise.
I have no basis on how I came up with that because I haven't been to Tijuana since my mom made the mistake of driving across the border from San Diego, thinking it would be a fun outing for the day, and then quickly tried to turn around and get us back to the States as quickly as possible. But yeah, it's got this is kind of a wild, crazy nose.
Well,
So
and again,
how- Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, speaking about good value drams, I mean, this is another one that's very reasonably priced, and especially for those folks who like something quirky and weirder, like a Lecheg 10 or something else like that. It's kind of in a similar vein for me. But sorry, Kurt, please go ahead.
This one throws me for a loop. I don't even remember what I was going to say there. I was listening to you wax poetic.
Well, and Doug, to kind of build on that, I think this is something if people are a fan of some of the weird and wacky stuff that comes out of Loch Lomond, I think this is a whiskey that's going to speak to you too. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with it in terms of flaws, but it is what it is. It's a 5-year-old peated medicinal mezcal-like young single malt, but it's fun.
It's like on the palate anyways, it's like if you let mezcal sleep in a bourbon barrel for 10 years, it's got like a caramelly soft vanilla sort of thing going on with all the dirtiness and fun. Weird one.
There's also a herbaceousness, almost like they distilled gin in this stills and didn't clean them out properly beforehand. Like
That's all over the nose for me. I don't get that so much on the palate. The palate's all mezcal to me.
it's just fascinating again for a 5-year-old whiskey that we're able to go this in depth with notes and it keeps it interesting. I think again it's just high praise for me. So and hence I think I'm on my second bottle myself of this. So full disclosure, I am.
Really
Yeah.
interesting.
I think Andrew mentioned it earlier and you just like hinted at it too. I think blindly I would think this was a Loch Lomond. Just based on what they do and their character and stuff, I don't think I would ever guess where this came from. I would probably think Loch Lomond.
Cool. All right. The speed round is not going as quickly as it would normally, but that's okay. Bruichladdich 2004 really stood out when we were last there. Is it? Oh man.
Oh man.
Oh man.
This is, I didn't want to say it before because I didn't fully believe it, but this is like old school ex-bourbon cask whiskey. It's like window putty, linseed oil.
Do you remember Charleston Chews? Like that sort of vanilla taffy that would have a chocolatey sort of cocoa undertone to it. Reminds me of that very much.
When you said that, Doug, it reminded me. So I have this, and he's still around. He's not in the industry anymore, but this lovely guy, Rob White, who used to be the rep for Severio Chirali, who used to be Bowmore's rep. And he always used to sneak out back during tastings to smoke deep woods. Those deep woods, I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about. Kind of like a cigar, but not really. And I think they must have been flavored somehow. And this reminds me of the smell, like going back behind the shop and Rob would be back there having a deep woods. Backwoods. Thanks to Kevin.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Lovely stuff. Just a quick side note. I feel like if we ever want to take these tastings to the next level, what I would absolutely subscribe and listen to is a podcast of Jeff just smack talking the entire time and making comments as the three of us pontificate about whiskey. I've been
like
a number of times already, so
he could have a YouTube channel where he talks over us in a little screen.
I would happily subscribe to his TikTok channel. I'll tell you that much right now. So just as a side note,
I still haven't figured out how to use TikTok. I've decided I'm too old. I cannot be taught new tricks, so or don't want to be taught new tricks. One or both, I'm not sure. Plus, they're going to take it away from us anyway, so why does it matter? Yeah, Bruichladdich 2004, still a great bottle. Yeah. All right. Or 2002 Bruichladdich now. Kurt is not impressed.
They're so frustrating. There's so much cool stuff there.
This is nosing it now is like nosing a completely random assortment of Jelly Bellies, including the ones they put in that kit, like the really I don't know if anyone's had the really spicy Jelly Bellies where it's like a game where you have to spin a wheel and you might end up on the Carolina Reaper and stuff like that. This nose, it's again, it's in some ways like that Finglassie. It's all over the place for me.
It's like if you took a cinnamon bun and crammed it into that burnt ham while somebody was lighting a pack of matches next to you. There's so many cool tones going on there, but left side.
Yeah, just massive cask influence on this. I think relative to some of the others where it's quite the contrast versus especially the last one.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of cool like chocolate and fruit tones together on the palate though.
Mm-hmm. Regardless, it's not as pretty, it's not as elegant. The sulfur note aside, like I think that wine cask is really dominant, and I don't dislike it, but I don't like it as much as I personally like the 2004. So
Is the 2004 still available?
according to the website, yes. How about Port Charlotte? And actually, Kurt, I'm getting a bit more of that sulfur on the finish. How about the Port Charlotte 2002? I think this one showed surprisingly well the first time around. I was actually a little worried about it. But yeah, it did well.
Yeah, I think this is lovely, especially going back through it again. And yeah, just a beautiful balance, richness from the cask. Still get some of that underlying distillate in there a bit. Feels like a great age. Still 56.3, which at least for me doesn't taste quite as hot as it could be probably at that ABV. So
Yeah, I'm really liking it. I'm enjoying some of those darker, chocolatey, earthy, spicy tones that are coming out of it. It's still fruity. The smoke is there, but it's kind of like a second or third player at best. It's kind of ashy, clean. And if there's a twinge of sulfur in there at all, I'm not picking anything up, to be honest, on this one. I personally think I would describe this myself as being clean. Kurt might disagree.
There's a little bit, but it's not bad. And I think this is a cracker. I love it. I think it's a slow burn of a whiskey. You'd want to spend a lot of time with it because it is still like a big, bold flavor spectrum you're working with there, but it's wicked. It's really wicked. And this reminds me, Doug could probably attest to, some of those old Port Charlottes when you get into the warehouse and you're drinking them right out of the barrel. They've got a lot of casks that are like this. So hopefully we see more of this sort of style. I think it's really cool.
All right, guys, before I trigger the poll, I've just got to finish adding a couple of options here on it.
well, we still need to talk about
We have
the
one more.
2005
Oh,
portrait.
yeah, why don't you guys move on? Why don't you guys do that while I get the poll ready to go?
It almost
I guess
feels a little floral.
There's that sort of like, yeah, floral, but still that sort of, it's not an OBE, like bottle effect sort of cardboardy, but there is that sort of note there that, especially compared to the last one.
So again, I always find that dull as a whiskey. I don't find this dull, but I know what you're talking about now, I think. For me, it's like white glue on construction paper.
Yeah, I could see that for sure.
Oh, yeah, like a kindergarten or something.
Yeah, man.
Or Doug at Beaver's camp.
That's exactly it. Andrew and I ran into each other last night at a Beavers meeting. So
Yeah. I had to pick up my godson. Doug had to pick up his actual son. So
yeah.
go. All right, I've still got two options to put in here.
Interesting nose, palate, can do it.
Yeah.
Hurts
But
the
I
nose.
feel confident going into this poll in terms of I think what my top two are with it. So but overall I think this showed really, really well. And I'm super excited that wherever these casks may come from, that they're sort of hitting the market, because it's really neat. And I think, you know, because we see less expressions of Bruichladdich, it's great to be able to see the IBs step in and fill that role that maybe the distillery did more of back in the day.
Mhm. Well,
I was excited about this tasting. I think Andrew was too. We were kind of chatting about it and don't know why our group wasn't bigger for this one. But Bruichladdich has always been one of the nearest and dearest to my heart. And this range, I think, is a cool range that, like I said, the little bit of a minefield thing about it makes it feel nostalgic. This was a fun day.
Kurt, I think part of it comes down to I'm not sure we gave this enough time to sell out. Partly, you know, these tastings come about because either we want to try things or because we've got stuff coming in and we want to sell it, or both. And I think I just assumed more people would be really excited about a tasting that included 4 early 2000s single casks of Bruichladdich.
I
And
think if Bruichladdich had been in the title, Andrew, it might have helped a little bit more too. Right?
I think the tasting was called Rest Bruichladdich.
Oh, it was, yeah. Maybe it was
so-
just the first part that distracted people. I don't know.
I mean, or it was just too cute. Like,
Maybe.
it was probably too cute. So
That is a problem we deal with a lot there, isn't it? We're just too cute for most people.
it happens. Anyway, while the votes are trickling in, most people have voted. You've only got a minute or two left to vote. At least one person's left. Kurt, I'll start with you. What were your two favorites tonight?
So I'm throwing out the honorable mention for construction. The first two are rock stars. I think they're absolute forms, platonic forms. That's how these whiskeys should be built. They are wicked. But number one and number two for me, just because they are a little more singular, a little more unique. The Bruichladdich 2004 and the Port Charlotte 2002.
And that's number one and number two for you?
Yeah, that first Bruichladdich, the really clean one, unreal. I want to spend so much time with that whiskey. And then that first Port Charlotte we did from the Rest and Bees was really, really cool. A lot of dimension.
Okay. Doug?
Wow, I don't know if Kurt and I have ever perfectly aligned on a 1-2 before in a whiskey tasting, but I will absolutely echo all of his comments about sort of the Laddie and the Port Charlotte 10 both being great OBs that I think are often available, which is wonderful. But I mean that 2004 Laddie is just such a creamy vanilla bomb that I just absolutely love, and going back to it the second time just really affirmed that. And I think the 2002 had a beautiful complexity, the Port Charlotte 2002 that really found a beautiful balance, all things considered, with it that I really enjoyed. So what about you, Andrew?
I hate to be, I love it when there's like disagreement, but I have to agree. Like, I think the 2004 Bruichladdich is hands down the best whiskey in tonight's tasting. Like, and it's not even for me just what I like or what I want. It's just, you know, it's a little different when not everybody, I'm guessing here, has the ability to try the same amount of stuff as everybody else. And I've definitely been spoiled in this regards. And to me, that 2004 Bruichladdich it stood head and shoulders above everything else. I was a little torn. I agree. The 2002 Port Charlotte is excellent. I almost went Port Charlotte 10 over it, just because I think it's definitely way better value. Like, I would much rather have a bottle of that than a bottle of the 2002 at the price it's going for. But I prefer the 2002 Port Charlotte. So it does edge it out slightly. It is a single cask. That is something you don't see very often. It is rare. And this does explain why the 2004 Bruichladdich and the Port Charlotte 2002 are the ones we're nearly sold out of, because they are definitely head and shoulders above the others. I'm a little bit more charitable towards the 2005, I think, than Kurt, the Port Charlotte. The 2002 Bruichladdich I struggle with a little bit as well, but still good. But yeah, it was a good range. I wish more people had tuned in tonight, because I would have loved to see a bigger data set for the results here. But sharing those results, the Bruichladdich 2004 was clearly the first favorite. The two Port Charlottes from Rest and B tied for second. And then when you look at second favorite, the 2004 is still the top whiskey for second favorite. And the 2005 and 10-year Port Charlotte coming in second. And Finglassie got some votes, so did the Laddie Classic. So everybody got a participation medal tonight, which I think was kind of fun. So nobody got excluded, which is great.
2002 Bruichladdich.
Oh, the 2002 didn't get a vote. All right. Thanks, Jeff. Way to be a buzzkill. I was trying to bring everybody up, leave this on a positive note where everybody felt good, including the 2002 Bruichladdich.
See, and this is why I'm going to subscribe to his judgment of all of us on his YouTube channel, and I'm so excited for it. So,
and he's going to pinpoint the moment in each tasting where, and this is the point where Andrew is actually drunk. 10 seconds before that, he was not. And here's how you can tell, because he starts slurring his speech. Yeah, Jeff, I don't know that that's a big money maker, but if it is, good for you and good for Doug for giving you the idea. But anyway, well, gentlemen, I appreciate you joining me for this tonight. It was a fun tasting. Hopefully we're going to see some of you guys on Thursday night at 5 p.m. for Angus McRailed. And again on Friday with Richard Urquhart, where we're going to be officially launching the casks we've now had for almost 2 months that are, I think, close to 2/3 sold out. But it's still going to be an awesome tasting. Thanks again. Have a great night. Thanks to Pacific Wine and Spirits, who helped. They supported this event, as they do every event where their brands are involved. They're a great company. Yeah, we'll talk soon, and good night.